on the phone today. We didn't have that last time, but we
Okay.
do have folks on the phone.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, I got one or two people just being admitted right now. Okay. Okay, I just started recording, so I think we can begin. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's stakeholder meeting for New Jersey Administrative Code, Title 7, Chapter 36, subchapters 25 and 26. And this is for the new rulemaking we're doing right now in the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration, or OTPLA, or OTPLA for short. This meeting is geared toward our local government partners. And today is December 15th, 2022. This meeting is going to take place between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. And my name is Caroline Keith, and I'm the Regulatory Officer for the Public Land Compliance section in the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration. And I'm going to serve as the moderator today. And just to review a general disclaimer before we begin, the information presented during this meeting is intended to facilitate discussion on various existing and potential regulatory mechanisms. No final agency decision regarding this information is expressed or implied. And again, just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded. And we're going to review attendance. For those of you attending via the Teams link today, please enter your first and last name in the chat box, as well as your affiliation. For those of you who are dialing in or who do not have access to the chat box, we're asking that you please send us your name, phone number, and affiliation to our email address. And that's otpla@dep.nj.gov. I'll say that again. otpla@dep.nj.gov. That's how we have a record of those in attendance today. Okay, to review the speaking and guidelines and etiquette for today's meeting. During the meeting, please make sure that your microphone is muted and your camera is turned off. Then during the discussion portion, to request the opportunity to respond or ask a question, please enter your name and affiliation in the chat box. When you're called on to speak, you can unmute yourself, and if you like, you can turn on your camera. And when you have finished speaking, we ask that you please remute yourself and turn off your camera. So for the call-in attendees, or those who can't access the chat, we're going to be taking some time halfway through the meeting and then towards the end of the meeting to give everyone a chance to speak and offer comments. We're going to see how this meeting goes and based on the number of attendees, but we're going to start off allotting 3 minutes per speaker. And if it looks like we're going to have time, we're going to allow more time for speaking, kind of do a more informal setup that we did on Tuesday. For technical problems, please either ask for assistance in the chat or send an email to our address at otpla@dep.nj.gov. And this is a reminder that if you think of something that you forgot to say today or want to submit something later, at any time you can submit comments or questions to the OPLA rulemaking team at our address, otpla@dep.nj.gov. And please put rulemaking in the subject line. And also, we're going to take about a 10-minute break halfway through the meeting too, just so everyone can get refreshed. Okay, at this time, I'd like to introduce Judith N.J.A.C. She is the Assistant Director for the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration. Judith will be leading the next portion of the meeting, and I will continue to serve as moderator. And Judith, I yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Caroline. So some of you may know that we had a reorganization almost a year ago at this point. Until that time, Nancy Lawrence, who was also helping us moderate, Caroline and I were part of the Green Acres program. And we and another section from Green Acres were pulled into this new office called Transactions and Public Land Administration. The purpose of the reorganization was to centralize certain functions, including internal legal review of contracts and grants, and legal oversight of both DEP-owned land and preserved land in which the department has an interest, such as Green Acres encumbered parkland. So what some of you may have known as the former Bureau of Legal Services and Stewardship in the Green Acres program is now the Public Land Compliance section within the Office of Transactions and Public Land Administration. That's the center part of this chart, and that's the section that's actually most directly responsible for the parts of the rules that we're talking about today. Nancy Lawrence, who's here with us today, is the manager of this section. Over on the left in the kind of yellowish tan color is our Public Land Administration section, which some of you may have known in the past as having been the Office of Leases and Concessions, formerly as part of the Assistant Commissioner's Office for Natural and Historic Resources. That assistant commissionership no longer exists. The Public Land Administration section is headed by Adria Wenzel. Over on the right in the pale purple color is what we now know as our Legal and Transactional Operations section. This is essentially the Green Acres closing team. It's headed by Lauren Persida and mostly consists of the paralegals that help us handle our real estate closings. Our new office is headed up by Rob Guzek as director, and as Caroline mentioned, I'm the assistant director. So this office was intended to bring a lot of functions related to administration of both the department's own land and other publicly preserved land into one place to ensure consistency of decision-making, and to hopefully over time improve efficiency in how we respond to requests to use properties, both DEP-owned and locally owned. For purposes of the upcoming rulemaking, our team is Rob Guzek, our director, myself, Nancy Lawrence, and Caroline Keefe, our regulatory officer. So what we're here to talk about today is what right now is part of the Green Acres rules. And if you go to the chat where you've been entering your name and affiliation, at the very top of the chat, we provided some links. One is to the existing rules. One is to a hot topics document that we distributed. We included our main email address, and we also included a link to our web page where you can find information about future meetings and our rulemaking process. So right now, subchapters 25 and 26 of the Green Acres rules apply to post-funding compliance requirements. Subchapter 25 outlines what our expectations are as far as managing property if you take Green Acres funding to acquire or develop it. These rules apply to both directly funded parkland and to what we call unfunded parkland, which is the other parks that you're required to put on your recreation and open space inventory as a condition of taking Green Acres funding. And then subchapter 26 is primarily what people know as our diversion application process. So for those occasions where someone wants us to request that we lift the Green Acres restriction, subchapter 26 has a pretty detailed process for how you can make that request. We last made substantive changes to these rules in 2005. And those of you who have attended the State Land Trust Conference or other presentations that we've given have been hearing us say for a long time that we intend to update the rules. So that time has finally come. But with the new reorganization, we're going to pull subchapters 25 and 26 out of the Green Acres rules and put them in a new chapter specific to the new office. There may be other topics that we end up covering in those rules as well. So we're here today not to talk about how you can obtain Green Acres funding and what the process is for funding, but to talk about what happens, as I usually put it, after you have the ribbon cutting and hand out the big fake check, and Martha Sapp's office hands the file to Nancy and says, here, we did this great project and you need to keep track of it for all time to make sure that the property we helped buy or develop stays as parkland. So we're here today to listen to those of you who have had experience with our post-funding requirements, talk about what you like, what you don't like, and what you think we should change. I know a little concern has been expressed over the hot topics list that we distributed. Those issues were intended to spur discussion, but to some degree they reflect things we get asked about on a regular basis and think we might have to address in the new rules. But I also want to put out there just right up front that there was some reaction to the fact that we put the word leases in there in our list. Right now, we do review leases for Green Acres funded parkland and some of the time for unfunded parkland. And we wanted feedback on that process, whether it's too difficult, whether there's other things we should consider, whether we should change the process. But it was not intended to be a prompt that we're considering wholesale commercialization of local parks. So I just want to put that concern to rest if I possibly can. And so as Caroline and I already mentioned, and as stated on the list of hot topics, that list is just for discussion purposes. We have not made any decisions. We really do want people's feedback, and this is one of several meetings where we're trying to solicit feedback. Since we have right now close to 50 people on the phone, as Caroline mentioned, we'll at least initially try to limit people's comments to 3 minutes, but we're here for the full 3 hours and we'll circle back and allow more time for comments if we possibly can. On Tuesday, we had about the same number of people on the phone, but the majority of the attendees did not want to comment, so we were able to engage in a little bit more of a discussion about things that people wanted to talk about. So we're somewhat going to play this by ear as far as whether we have to stick to the 3 minutes. And as Caroline already mentioned, if after the session you have things you want to bring to our attention or you have comments you don't want to make on the record today, just send us an email to the address at the bottom, otpla@dep.nj.gov. Please just put the word rulemaking in the subject line so we can sort through the emails more easily. We'll be collecting written comment all through the process of collecting stakeholder input and drafting the new rules. So feel free to send us an email at any time. I just also want to mention that we do have additional meeting dates in January. We anticipate doing a session on January 11th that's geared towards our nonprofit funding partners. We're going to try to do another session for local governments on January 18th. And then the last 2 weeks in January, we're going to do 2 sessions on the 24th and the 26th, open to the general public, and 1 session in the evening the following week. We haven't picked a date yet, also geared towards the general public. So if you go in the chat, there's a link to the page where we've posted all these rulemaking notices. The link to join the meeting is going to be identical for all the meetings, so you just need to look on our website to see what the date and time is for the future meetings, and you can hop back into the additional stakeholder meetings if you would like. So I'm going to leave to Nancy and Caroline how to determine the order of commenters. And, I'll jump in if I feel it's necessary to correct something or there's a quick answer I can give to somebody. But again, we'll just have to see how many people want to comment to determine how much time we can give you. I'll hand it back to you, Caroline.
Okay, Nancy, I think we have a comment. I don't see a link in the chat. If you could maybe just copy the links down. I think since we're using the same Teams meeting, it's like an ongoing chat, so you kind of have to scroll.
Yeah, I think if you
up.
can see the chat, you need to scroll up, but maybe we can duplicate that post.
Yeah, we can stick it down. So yeah, for those right now attending on the Teams link, if you just want to put your name and affiliation in the chat, if you'd like a turn to speak, comment, or ask questions. And I think we'll start with those on the Teams link, and then we'll go to the call in a little bit to give folks who are called in a chance. But let's see. So right now, see Nancy reposted all the links again. We're just waiting for folks to get in line. I think we have sometimes a long line, sometimes a short line. Does anyone have any questions or comments they wish to start off with?
So we did ask you to put your name and affiliation in the chat as a way of taking attendance, but if you want to comment, please put in the chat that you'd like to comment, or as long as we don't have too many people doing it, you can use the raise your hand function. It's just a little hard to determine the order in which people raise their hand. So I don't know who would like to go first.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I see Robert Moss. Robert Moss would like to comment. Mr. Moss, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay,
Can you hear
can
me?
go ahead. Yes, this is Mr. Moss.
Yes. I did not actually expect to speak before hearing anything, but my comments, I'll try to get them in 3 minutes. I did submit detailed rules. Judith may remember that rule proposals or requests for rulemaking. Everyone was rejected except one that was just a typo being corrected. My proposals all had to do with tightening up what I consider to be very loose and casual treatment of requests for diversions or exceptions. I'll just try to remember one example. In Bergen County, it had to do with a new building on parkland, a percentage of space that could be used for non-recreational purposes. And as far as I'm concerned, the DP, the Green Acres people, helped this town. I forget which town it is offhand. They said, take the space it's covered with a roof, but it has no walls. It's like a patio where you can eat food. Count that. How does this work now? They said count that as indoor space, and then you have your percentage of indoor space that can be used for indoor recreation increases because you're taking this patio, which is by no means indoors, but you're counting it as indoors. Increase the total indoor space, and then there's a certain percentage you can use for indoor recreation. That kind of thing I see over and over again. I submitted detailed requests for rulemaking. All were rejected. That's my main concern. Have been over the years. The DEP is just too easy giving out exceptions and things like I just mentioned. If I didn't state it clearly, maybe somebody could ask me more exactly what I meant. And I think that'll do for now because nobody else has said anything yet. So I can't comment on anything I've heard.
Mr. Moss, if you recall, on at least some of the issues you raised in your rulemaking petition, we did say that the reason we didn't want to take action at that time was that we wanted to solicit input from a variety of stakeholders before we made any decisions. So that's actually part of what this process is about, to get other perspectives on these issues. You know, often towns and counties feel our process is way too complicated and difficult. So I think there might be contrary opinions on some of this, but we do understand your concerns.
Okay, I'll check that. I don't recall that getting that response. I'll have to check on that, and I can get back via the email.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to unmute.
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else in the chat who'd like to comment. Maybe anyone who has called in. If you'd like to unmute yourself and comment or ask a question.
Caroline, there was a comment made via email that they're not able to see the chat. So if there's anyone that cannot see the chat, if you want to raise your hand as Judith suggested, or let me know that you can't see the chat, and at the APLA email address, and we can call on you at that point if you can't do the raise the hand or see the chat.
I don't know if it's worth maybe, Judith, for us to just kind of go through the hot topics list that it's listed.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out what topics we might want to throw out there for discussion. So I would say that the two topics that have come up already in previous stakeholder sessions pretty consistently are hunting and forestry. So we had hunting on our hot topics list to begin with. And for us, the issue is that we don't really address hunting in all that much detail in the current rules, but we get a lot of questions about what's allowed, what's not allowed, and how to fairly allocate hunting privileges. And over the years, we had developed a perspective that, some towns treated hunting as a recreational activity, but some towns were approaching it more as almost as engaging someone as a service provider to control deer as a deer management program. But sometimes the criticism of that was that the entity that was selected as the deer management entity wasn't always chosen fairly, or people felt excluded from recreational hunting. So more recently, our own Fish and Wildlife program has been kind of pushing us in the direction that we should treat all hunting as recreational. It should just be all random, first come, first serve, and that would be the best way to approach this. I guess we're looking for input from those who actually run their own hunting programs, and we realize we're probably going to have to address that at least in a little more detail in the upcoming rules as far as what we think is reasonable and not. I'll pause there if anybody wants to comment on hunting. If not, we can tell you what some of the other topics are that have come up in these meetings.
Not seeing anything.
I did see we've had both Monmouth and Hunterdon County on the phone. Maybe they want to share with us how they run their hunting programs and whether that's been successful. Karen Gilbert from Raritan Township would like to comment on hunting. Go ahead.
Good morning. So we do have a what we call a wildlife management program that we go out to bid to local hunting groups to help us manage the herd. We have a significant overpopulation of deer in Hunterdon County and in Raritan Township in particular. And we found this program to actually be very successful. We do the bid process allows us to collect fees from the hunters, and the fees that we receive from that go into our open space funds, which we then use to maintain our properties and our parks. I would not want to see that opportunity go away. I really would like to be able to continue that, and to have it go to just purely for recreation would not accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, because we do have requirements that you have to, take a non-antlered deer. You can't just go out and get the bucks. So taking the does off the property is part of the wildlife management control. I would highly recommend that we be allowed to continue that.
So a couple of things there. To the extent you can share your bid documents with us so we can see how you structure your program, I think that would be helpful for us. And
Absolutely.
do you have any sort of coordination with Fish and Wildlife? Are you an officially approved, I think they call it community-based deer management program?
That's a good question. I did not implement this. I took over from the previous business administrator. I will have to find that out.
Yeah, and we're not going to communicate with Fish and Wildlife about that one way or another, but I'm aware that they have such a program. And so we were at least debating whether the way to manage hunting that's not purely recreational was to tell our funding partners that you can do a program similar to what you're describing if you do it through Fish and Wildlife. So I'm just curious whether your particular program is already done in coordination with Fish and Wildlife, or whether it's something that sounds like it might be similar to what they do. Although they tell us there's not that many community-based deer management programs that they have approved. And they don't see it as being as efficient a way of controlling the deer population as recreational hunting, but I don't have the statistics on that to know one way or another. So it's useful to know what people are doing and what they think is effective.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, our hunters are very active. We live in a county where there's a large population of people who do like to hunt. And there are a lot of properties that we found that the open space properties were being hunted anyway, with no controls. And I don't know how you get statistics about that, because you don't have to report to the township how many deer you've harvested. So yeah, that's curious.
Interesting. Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else would like to comment on what they do now on hunting, what they find effective, what they'd like to be able to do.
I can chime in for how the Hunterdon County handles our deer management program. We sell permits. We obviously they're kind of park specific. We outline how many hunters can hunt per each individual property based on the characteristics of that property, whether it's we limit it to the bow only in certain instances when there's certain property constraints, obviously nearby houses and things like that, taking in mind the safety zones and things like that. Our program is very successful. Sometimes we have people camp out overnight when the permits go on sale. And but with that being said, those are folks that are trying to get kind of, let's say, the prime spots, or the spots that are close to their houses. So it's easy for them. We do have some challenges in some of our more remote parks where we can't sell any permits, just because it's hard for the hunters to get the deer out of those properties. So our more terrain challenging hunts, that's where we kind of don't get the interest in getting those permits. So they are over the counter. There are first come first serve. We don't reserve or take reservations for specific things, specific properties. So that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out, how we can best kind of spread the use out a little bit and kind of up our harvest numbers.
Yeah, I was wondering whether those properties that are terrain challenged, I would assume you still have problems with there being too many deer there.
We have problems with too many deer all over the place. The hunters can't keep up, basically.
Thank you. That's very helpful to know what you do. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on hunting as far as what they do or how they think we should approach this. I mean, what I was referring to earlier was we do hear sometimes, and it sounds like the two examples we've just been given, that it hasn't been an issue, but we do hear sometimes that when, towns and counties adopt a program of bidding it out or giving out permits, sometimes there's situations where they decide they want to lease to a particular hunt group. That gets a little problematic because then someone has to join a group to hunt public land. And sometimes there's accusations of favoritism in how those groups are selected. We've also encountered situations where towns want to engage their own public works employees or public safety employees as their deer management crew. And again, we often hear complaints about that as giving prime hunting grounds essentially to favored individuals. So we're trying to strike a balance between what towns feel is effective and what the public feels is fair. I think something I said Karen wanted to comment on. Go ahead.
Yeah, we don't specifically limit our hunting to hunting groups, but because the bids can be quite high, we recommend that individuals join those groups. And whenever I get a call from an individual hunter, I refer them to the hunting groups, and a lot of times they just join those groups. So we try and accommodate people to make sure that they're able to hunt if they choose to do so. And the hunting groups that have been hunting on our properties for the past 4 years have been very cooperative in that respect.
So then the group as an entity bids on those opportunities, and they're able to bid more because they're a group.
Correct.
Okay, interesting. I mean, it sounds like it is a revenue source for you.
It is. It does help us with the with the maintenance of properties. We didn't really look to pursue it in that respect. It was just kind of like, well, we're going to have to manage this, so we need to charge fees, etc. Oh, and by the way, we are just archery, just bow hunting. We do not allow any guns. But it is the hunters appreciate it. And when we get really good feedback from our hunters about it, we do get people coming to township committee meetings asking about the program and how it works. And like I said, I always refer them to the hunt groups, and then they spread the cost out accordingly. We don't have any limits as to how many hunters can belong to a group. We leave it up to them to basically control who hunts when on those properties.
But then an individual could bid on one of those opportunities if he or she wanted to.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Would anyone
Judith,
else like?
can I make a comment, please?
Sure, go ahead.
I am just speaking for myself. This is Nancy Lawrence. But starting the beginning of November, I will get anywhere from 3 to 10 calls a week or emails people looking to hunt properties. So if that is something that your municipality, county is looking into allowing, there are people out there that are looking for places to hunt. So if that is something that you're thinking about, I would, what Hunterdon County is doing, it pretty much is what our rules would really like to see happening, that it's just first come, first serve. But there are other ways of doing it, and I would suggest perhaps looking into it if you have a deer problem. And if you're not sure if you offer hunting, will folks come? As just one person, I can't speak for the rest of the compliance officers in this section, but I know we all get a lot of calls, and they continue throughout the year, but the peak is November, October, November, December, of folks looking for places to hunt. We always then turn them back to the local unit that owns the park, because we don't know whether or not you allow for hunting. But I just wanted to put out there are a lot of hunters looking for an opportunity for a place to hunt, if that's something that you are thinking about. I think if you allow it, they will come. That's all.
Oh, Judith, you're muted. Okay.
Sorry. All I was saying was, before we pick another topic off the list, does anyone else want to talk about what they do with hunting, what they've tried that maybe hasn't worked in the past, what they're thinking about doing? Okay, I just have to pull up the list for myself, and I'll pick another topic off there to throw out there in 1 second. So I mentioned that another topic we've been hearing a lot about is forestry. And this started last fall, that a couple of nonprofits asked to meet with us to talk about the rules, but a lot of the discussion ended up centering on forestry. And those of you who are familiar with the forestry project at the Sparta Mountain Wildlife Management Area are probably aware that that project was very controversial and sparked a lot of concern about forestry activities on public land. Since then, we've had a couple of, in the first session that we had, the stakeholder session that we geared towards the nonprofits, forestry was brought up again. It was brought up this past Tuesday from the perspective of municipalities. So I do see Bob Moss wants to comment on this. I just want to give a little background as to the comments we've been getting so far. So our nonprofit partners would like to see Green Acres get more involved in regulating forestry activities on parkland. Right now, kind of like hunting, we don't really say anything in detail one way or another about forestry, other than that forestry is part of the definition of recreation and conservation purposes, which is the overarching definition for Green Acres funding. So we give funding to acquire or develop land for recreation and conservation purposes. And that's a statutory definition that includes the word forestry, but doesn't say what forestry is for that purpose. So certainly up until now, when people have started expressing concern about this topic, if someone came to us and said, I have a forest management plan, a forest stewardship plan that has been approved by the department's Division of Forestry, State Forest Service, to us, Green Acres, now OTPLA, that's forestry. We were not raising any obstacles there. More recently, people are encouraging us that they're concerned that there's not necessarily a public process associated with approval of forestry plans, and so often the public doesn't find out about these activities until they're implemented and literally the chainsaw is out on the property and everybody gets upset. Last Tuesday, or just this past Tuesday, we had at least one municipality, I think it was, say, it was the county, say, please don't make forestry activities harder for us. We need to maintain our properties. So we're trying to find that middle ground. We're trying to strike a balance between the concerns that some of the nonprofits have expressed and the practicalities of actually managing these properties. And we'd be interested in people's perspectives. Bob, go ahead. I'm thinking you might be muted. We can't hear you if you're speaking.
Sorry about that. I starting first, haven't heard much from other people, but my concern has been slightly different from that of the other advocacy groups. And in Sparta Mountain, in particular, I spent a lot of time with the plan itself, the practice plans. I've been out there. You've heard of people like Sylvia Salone and so on. But as under Green Acres, since Sparta Mountain in particular was all Green Acres funding, according to the website, the DP website, I've been looking at the Green Acres regulation and the meaning of conservation. Well, conservation obviously can include managing land for the benefit of one species or one type of habitat and so on. That just can't be rationally questioned. What I have wanted to put in the opposition to the plan as it is now is the removal of forest products. And other people are talking, so maybe we should emphasize that. Removal of forest products for sale on the market is definitely not conservation. And in the original plan, the 2017 plan in Sparta Mountain, it's very explicit. I was looking up the exact words when I was called to speak, but it's very explicit that there is not the removal of the timber is not for conservation, but it is an added benefit which DEP would be remiss not to take advantage of in terms of revenue. So more recently, DEP, and as far as I understand, this is not anybody in Green Acres, but you've got people that of whom we don't approve in DEP now. But there has been a new justification invented for removal of forest products in that it enhances regeneration. So that's a quote, enhances regeneration. In other words, you cut the trees. If you want a young forest and you got an old forest, you got to cut trees. And somehow, we don't know what enhances regeneration means, and there's no citation to any scientific studies, any literature, any journal articles, nothing. This is clearly just invented. So my first point is it's already against the law, absolutely. Not that that bothers a lot of people in our state, which is the most corrupt in the country. But it is clearly against the law, starting with the Bond Acts, constitutional provisions. Judith mentioned the statutory provisions. However, it may not hurt to be more explicit in the regulations also. And some of the advocacy groups want to be talking about this. What can we put in the Green Acres regulations? Whatever is put in should reflect the law as it is now. Maybe elaborate a little. And again, I'm talking about forest management plans, forest stewardship plans, where they call for removal of forest products and for sale on the market, which is what's going on in Sparta Mountain now. We've got pictures of the logs stacked up. We've got the contracts, so on. Those are going off to mills somewhere for definitely a commercial activity. As far as more generally, some people don't want the trees cut in any case. They get really personally upset. And I've seen this reactions in the field to people watching the trees come down. Whether we should be doing this kind of forest management, again, which New Jersey Audubon and so on are pushing, protecting and encouraging young forest species, young forest habitats, golden wing warbler comes up a lot, but they insist there's more to it. Whether we should be doing that can open a can of worms. And I'm actually not, I want to say that, but I'm not sure if I want to get too involved. I do want to say, though, and I have said this in comments I've submitted, programs to encourage or protect endangered species, threatened species, should not be done piecemeal based on property boundaries that are arbitrary as far as nature is concerned. The state, at the state level, as you know, the state cannot use Green Acres funds, cannot use eminent domain with Green Acres funds. And those that were there when Sparta Mountain was created, we know the state made a deal with Glendon Development Corporation. They got what they could. They could not use eminent domain. And the boundaries of Sparta Mountain Wildlife Management Area have very little relationship to the topography, the habitats, and so on. Managing forest land and space generally for different types of habitats to protect different species should be done on a regional-wide basis. In the case of the warbler, I would say northeastern United States, maybe northwestern New Jersey, but going piece by piece because you happen to own a property, and you being DEP, and you can go in there and we'll cut this land, we'll cut this stand here, we'll cut that stand the next year. That is disorganized. Let me use polite language. That is a disorganized way of going about habitat management. There should be a statewide plan, inventories. What types of habitats are already available? How much young forest is there, for example, in northwestern New Jersey? Are there private owners who would be interested in getting into a program where they manage for young forest? That might be a good topic for the regulations. I'm just throwing this out. But it shouldn't be necessary, but it would probably be good if the regulations specifically prohibited removal of forest products for commercial purposes. I think that should do for now.
Let me just say as a counterpoint, and this is not expressing my personal opinion, but what we hear as a contrary position to what you just said in your conclusion is two things. Sometimes we're told that removal and sale of forest products is just an incidental effect of implementing one of these plans.
Yes, that's the plan.
I think other times, though, we're told that the ability to sell those products is necessary to finance the development and implementation of the plan for whatever conservation objective you're trying to achieve, whether it's health of the forest or habitat management. So those are the counter arguments we hear to what you've just told us. Where the truth lies on that is hard for me to know because I'm not a forester. But I appreciate your perspective, and that's kind of what we're struggling with here.
Judith, may I just answer that very quickly?
Sure.
Yeah. As funding, it should not be mysterious to you. When they're talking about funding, that's not details of forest management. But why not build an office building, rent it out, and then use the money to manage the rest of the property? That's my brief answer.
Would anyone else like to talk about forestry? I'm not seeing anything in the chat. As far as the aspect of developing these plans and people feeling like they don't have notice of them when our department is reviewing them, we have suggested to some of the nonprofits who have raised that issue that they should talk to our forestry program as well and see if they would like to enhance their public process. I'm assuming that their statute does not require public notice or a public hearing. So, I understand where people sometimes get upset when they don't know about a plan until it's being implemented. But, we haven't spoken directly to our forestry counterparts yet about this issue. We're still in information gathering stage. Okay, let's see what else we might want to pick off our hot topic list. So one of the things we put on the list was that we've considered for a while whether there's room in our rules to carve out a very small category of what we would call small scale solar projects to allow siting of solar on parks as both a revenue opportunity for parks management and a way of supporting the state's green energy goals. And we've always been supportive of the notion of putting solar panels on buildings or carports, those kinds of structural applications. But we recognize that, first of all, there's infrastructure costs associated with putting up parking canopies. But most times building rooftop solar is not going to generate a whole lot of revenue for your park. What we would consider doing is if there's already cleared areas on relatively large parks, whether a small area could be dedicated to solar, both to help power your facilities, raise a little bit of revenue, and again, support solar statewide. I think we've gotten comments on both sides of that issue, that some people think that's a good idea and some people think it's a terrible idea and the start of a slippery slope. So I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that one way or another. I know we DEP are approached quite a bit about, from companies looking for sites for solar. Generally, we have not chosen to enter into those projects on our own properties. But I'm curious whether our funding partners feel like that's a missed opportunity or something that their parks could accommodate. So hang on one second. Bob Moss would like to comment on solar. That's fine. If others would like to as well, but I'll let Bob go first. Go ahead.
Am I on mute now?
No, you're good.
So sorry.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. I never got unmuted. All right. Here, this is my general problem with the Green Acres thing. It's very clear that the use has to be conservation, and we have a general problem here. solar panels, and Judith, you just used the term revenue. If the purpose is conservation or public outdoor recreation or historic, it's got to be that use. Generating solar for revenue is not public outdoor recreation or any of either of the others. And we do have revenue issues when it's, and I think I've been involved in discussions with this, when it's sports facilities and I don't know, high school football games and so on, where admission may be charged, or county golf courses. That's another one. I believe, and I don't have this in my head, I believe the general principle is, and it certainly should be, the revenue, say, from a golf course should be used only for maintenance and operation of the golf course. And that would mean the golf course is a recreational use. The revenues are not going, they're not being charged for some other county purposes like, you know, the county budget. And the same thing here. If you get revenues but here's the difference. The solar panels are not a recreational use, nor conservation, nor historic. And when we say conservation, we don't mean saving the planet from climate change by conserving energy. That's not what conservation means in the Green Acres regulations. So the solar panels, right now we have for farmland, I think, and the limitation is solar panels can be used only to power the operations of the farm, which makes sense. I wouldn't fight that. But when you say, well, we're going to take a corner and put solar panels up and get revenue, that's not recreation, and you're generating revenue on land that's supposed to be used for conservation and public outdoor recreation. That is not consistent with the Green Acres laws. And I would mention that when you have a corner of a field or something, solar panels, this is the old balloon problem. You need a lot of land to get a significant amount of electricity from solar panels. So we're not going to be just putting a couple corners. And as Judith pointed out, parkland doesn't usually have enough rooftops to have any significant amount of solar. So I don't see how solar panels for revenue generation they just don't fit the Green Acres restrictions. Are already in place, again, the bond acts, the constitutional provisions, and the statutes. And the regulations, as far as I'm concerned, should reflect that. If they want to be more elaborate, more strong, make it stronger, that's fine. But the only use, the things like the farmland program is fine, power stuff on the farm. That's a little different from the parkland, but it's the same idea. You use it, the solar panels apply to the use that the law permits on the farms, and that should be true here. If you want to put on a rooftop of a park building, fine, that's great. But starting to cover up fields for revenue is just not permitted.
So if we allowed it, it would be for revenue to go directly into the park system because everyone has challenges with having enough money to maintain their parks properly. And I understand that you don't agree with that. I'll just also say, though, that we agree with you that in the early days of solar, people were making that argument to us that this is conservation, and we said no, it's not conservation under our definition. So we do agree with you on that we're not approaching this that green energy is conservation within the definition of recreation and conservation purposes, but the question is, can you do something on the property in a very de minimis way that would enable you to maintain the property better? Now, your comment that something that small scale might not be economically feasible or might not generate that much revenue, that's something to take into account as to whether that approach would really work. So I do appreciate your comments. I don't know if any of our other funding partners on the phone have considered this type of project, have looked into the economics, whether it's something you would like to see us allow. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody.
Just a reminder, maybe we let those who called in too. I think we can just speak it. I don't think we're going to be pressed for time. If folks who have called in, I think you can just say your name, your affiliation, and you'd like to comment or question at this point too.
Yeah, I think we only have a couple of people on the phone. Okay, Nancy, I'm going to let you pick a topic off the list based on questions you get on a regular basis from people.
Uh-oh, now you're putting me on the spot. I was just
Sorry.
happy to not hear any comments, so that means everyone loves the diversion process and everyone loves change in use and Rosie amendments, so I was just happy to hear that. But I don't have the hot topics open, so. Look at that, recreation, open space, inventory amendments, change in use, and notice requirements. Those are the first three on the hot topics. You know, we've been getting a lot of flood control facilities and green infrastructure. I don't know if anyone here on this particular call is looking into any of that and whether or not they're considering. Certainly parkland is along a lot of waterways, so flood control is certainly an issue, especially in our more urban areas. So if anyone has any comments about allowing green infrastructure on parkland, whether it is something that shouldn't be there, whether it is something that we should wholeheartedly support. But I have gotten a few. One of my responsibilities is to look at land use permits to see if they're impacting what is being proposed is impacting parkland, and that is something that right now we look at and determine whether or not it's okay on the park depending upon what's going on. But it would be nice to hear from some folks on the call whether or not they have any comments about flood control projects. Army Corps, been attending some of those meetings. They're doing a lot of stuff within the state and or green infrastructure.
Yeah, I should probably comment on that a little as well. We've certainly gotten inquiries from groups like New Jersey Future, and there's another nonprofit called Jersey Waterworks, and some of our universities are working on flood control and green infrastructure research and guidelines. Up until now, we kind of deal with those projects on a case-by-case basis. I think we would probably want to articulate in a little more detail in the new rules what types of projects are generally allowed and what types are not. Similar to this discussion we were just having about forestry, flood control is not part of the definition of recreation conservation purposes, but watershed protection is. So, our thinking is definitely evolving given the challenges that we have in the state as to what constitutes watershed protection, what can we allow on parks, what not. In the northern part of the state, where you have a lot of municipalities with combined sewer overflow problems, we've kind of come to the conclusion that most any stormwater control project is going to be watershed protective because it's going to keep sewage out of the waterways. Although we would want to see that a project that we're asked to accommodate on a park is part of a CSO control strategy. And we're still going to be concerned that allowing recreational use of the park is still the priority and not the stormwater control projects. But we've had a couple of requests recently to put basins under parks and various other things that we've been able to try to strike a balance between the needs of the surrounding community and the park. Whether we should put limitations or parameters on that, I think is something we're going to consider as part of this rulemaking. And then, as Nancy mentioned, the flood control projects, especially post Sandy, if you look in some of the areas, particularly up in Monmouth County, that were pretty hard hit, about the only place people can think to put some of this infrastructure is in the parks. And so again, we're trying to strike a balance between what really is not intrusive on the parks, is not harmful to recreation and conservation, and what will provide those flood control benefits. So anybody with real world experience or who has an opinion on what we should or should not allow, we'd be happy to hear from you about that. So someone said I would like to discuss stormwater. Okay, we have a couple of people. Let's start with Sharon McCullough.
Hi, good morning. So I am from Haddonfield down in South Jersey. Hi, Caroline. This is an issue that we absolutely are dealing with down here. We're, a 300-year-old community where most of our infrastructure is non-existent because of how our community has been built out for so long. And we are looking to put infrastructure in, and with the increase in the rainfall and intensity of the rainfall at times, we are definitely having that urban flooding issue. We have several projects that we're looking at for the long term that can help address some of that, but all of those must include having to put pipes across property, parkland property that is currently on our Rossi and part of Green Acres. When we've had some discussion, years ago, the concern is you can't necessarily put a pipe across Green Acres, but if you're putting the park back to what it is on top so that it can continue to be used either as passive or active recreation, I'm not sure what the concern is about putting infrastructure underneath the park. So we really need Green Acres to look at being able to allow these types of things, especially in your dense urban areas where you don't really have much other choice.
So a couple of things before we go on to the other commenters. I think you're right that if you talked to us years ago, we probably said, no way. I think our thinking is evolving on stormwater control and green infrastructure. That being said, we still do feel like underground pipes are intrusive. A lot of times, if you install something underground, you then can't put the backstop for your ball field. You can't put your restroom structure in that area. And we try to evaluate those things when they're presented to us. And a lot of times, what you're describing, the pipe involves having to grant an easement to some entity other than the town, an MUA, a water company, something like that. So there's a couple layers of complexity there, but I would say that at the present, as far as I know, Haddonfield's not a CSO community, but if the municipality were able to demonstrate to us that this is part of an overall plan for watershed protection in your area, that we would try to work with you to try to accommodate those projects if we feel that it's not going to unduly interfere with the primary use of the property as for recreation. And we also, I'm assuming your area might be a little more developed, but we also don't necessarily want to sacrifice trees in wooded area to create corridors for pipes or big basins on parks either. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I think our thinking has evolved and that we're trying to accommodate these projects to the extent we can. So it sounds like we'll be talking to you some more about that. Right, and Mr. Moss is pointing out that underground infrastructure periodically needs to be dug up. So it's not the fact so much that it's underground that is the concern for us. And that argument, we hear that argument from natural gas pipeline companies who are putting really big pipes underground, and they say, shouldn't matter, it's underground, we'll cover it over, no harm, no foul. And I think the best analogy there is, would you want that in your backyard? Wouldn't you feel like that was limiting the use of your property? So we can't really give a pass to things just because they're underground, but something that really is truly green infrastructure, stormwater control is part of a bigger plan, and not just to reduce flooding for a couple of houses next to the park. We're trying to be as flexible as we can. But we do have a couple of other people who want to comment on that. Alizar, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name. If you could just give us your affiliation also.
That's quite all right. It's Zorgio. And
Okay.
I know after saying it, it's probably not any easier to pronounce. Thank you for allowing me the chance to speak on the matter. I would follow up with sort of a seconding the concerns shared by the folks from Haddonfield. I work for Collier's Engineering and Design, and we had just submitted a FEMA brick grant on behalf of the Borough of Highlands, whom is attempting to mitigate a pretty significant flooding, debris runoff, and major stormwater infrastructure improvement. We ran into a number of issues with Green Acres encumbered lands, as that the stormwater doesn't care what the regulations say or what the land is zoned for or what's permitted use. In some cases, it seems to be our only option. Now, I do understand that alternatives need to be explored, and you have to find ways to avoid impacting Green Acres land whenever possible. But at a certain point, it does somewhat feel like we kind of have no choice. So I think any further guidance would be helpful in understanding, what can be done to mitigate flooding and to install stormwater infrastructure within Green Acres encumbered properties. Now, very similar to some of the items already mentioned, we did alter our scope to take infiltration basins and pipes underground so as to not impact the recreational use of the property. And I know that that alone would be very helpful if that was a permitted use on that land. I do understand the balancing act that you are stuck with in attempting to preserve recreation, but at the same time, these efforts are in the interest of preserving life and property. So, I guess all that we could ask is that there is a reasonable, common sense approach taken to it. And I just would agree with the need for further guidance and understanding on what can be done and how we can help balance that process by being flexible, on both sides of the conversation.
So as I mentioned, I think the biggest chance of success you would have with a project like that is you need to demonstrate to us that it's part of a watershed protection strategy. So we're not the flood control program, the protection of property values or life and limb is not exactly our purview, but we are allowed to accommodate watershed protection. So if there is a regional plan that your project is a component of, or there's a study that shows how implementing the project will improve water quality in the particular watershed, that's what we would need to see to be able to accommodate these projects. But even then, we're still going to have to strike balance. We might not want to allow everything that the plan proposes if we think it's going to unduly interfere with recreation or future use of the park. I mean, unfortunately, particularly in urban areas, people look to the parks to be the solution to a whole variety of problems. So in the days when there was a lot of money for schools construction, people wanted to build schools on the parks because they looked around and it was the only open land they saw. We're kind of going through a similar phase with flood control and green infrastructure right now, that people look down the street and say, why can't it be on the park? But it's a park first. So
Right.
we're trying to evolve in our thinking, but it still has to be in the context of watershed protection. And Mr. Moss is expressing the opinion in the comments that we should classify some of these projects as at least as diversions of parkland, which would mean the areas would have to be replaced. So, that's what we're struggling with. Are they diversions or not diversions? So, Mr. Moss, if you want to, I don't know if you've said what you want to say in the chat or whether you want to speak about that.
Yeah, am I still on?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is pointing up the general remarks, and I thought of this after this this session started. Mr. Zerja was giving an example, like, and then Judith elaborated. Again, it's what I call the balloon. We're the most crowded state, and there is a real problem with finding space to do things. Now, you probably saw I sent a posted to Judith. She's right that the replies to my proposed changes to the regulations included a section describing how this process now is going to happen. There are general rule changes coming up, so some of these things that I proposed could be addressed then. But again, as illustrated by Mr. Zerju and so on, a lot of my proposals, I'm on the left wing, I want to tighten up. I want to tighten up the restrictions. A lot of my proposals, now I'm putting on another hat, might cause problems or might not be appetizing to local government units and nonprofits because I'm proposing to make things more difficult. I actually, I'll just say this: it might be worthwhile to sending out the DEP's response to my rulemaking, and nonprofits and local government units can see what was proposed, what was said. Well, this is maybe on hold. It would give them something concrete to comment on if they want to put the time into reading it. That's just something I thought of as this thing has been going on this morning. Just to be fair, I mean, if they know what was proposed and it might be coming up now, and you're going to be doing, they'll give them a handle. Hey, I don't like Bob Moss's proposal; it's too strict. If people want it, we should get comments from everybody, even if I would have to, argue back against them.
We could certainly link. I believe our response to your rulemaking petition is elsewhere on the department's website. I can pull a link into the page where we're listing all the stakeholder meetings and giving people the hot topics.
Yeah, not for this minute right now.
Make people aware that that's out there.
Yeah, just because it's the process is going to be ongoing, so they have time to read it and comment on things, right?
Yes, we're planning a bunch more meetings in January. In between, we're just sort of, gathering our thoughts as to what we might want to do or might not want to do. But our administration does want us to work on this pretty seriously in 2023. So, shortly after those January meetings, I think we're going to start meeting internally to make some policy decisions and start drafting the new rules. So anything that anybody wants to send to us in the next couple of months, we will take into account. Okay, would anyone else like to comment on stormwater, green infrastructure, flood control, what you think we should or should not allow? Okay, I'll just throw out there a question about the diversion application process in general. So back in 2005, when we last made substantive changes to the rules, Brad Campbell was our commissioner, and at the time, our nonprofit partners felt like the Green Acres diversion process was too easy. We didn't actually specify back then compensation ratios or a lot of the detail we now have in the process. And I think they felt that a one-to-one substitution of replacement land for parkland was not a disincentive to diversions, made the process too easy, and shortchanged the public. So when we did the rules in 2005, we certainly raised the compensation requirements, although we also, for the first time, made a distinction between minor and major categories of diversions. A couple of things since then. I think we've realized that although we tried to treat some diversions as more minor than others, that in practice we didn't really make the process different enough from major diversions to lift some of the burden on the applicants of the process, that the minor process is still substantially the same as the major process, except it involves one public hearing instead of two. And so we didn't really achieve our objective of making that process a little easier for small projects with an obvious public purpose, such as, really small intersection improvements and that kind of thing. So certainly something we're considering now is how to ease up even a little more on minor projects. They'd still be a diversion, but are there things we can streamline in the process so that we're not holding up very small public works projects that affect parkland? But the other thing we do hear from people is that our overall process is too difficult. So even though on an individual basis, people acknowledge that it shouldn't be easy to divert parkland because parks were supposed to be preserved in perpetuity. When it comes to individual projects, everyone tries to argue that their project is different and our process is too burdensome and we're impeding whatever public benefits they're trying to provide. So those of you who have experienced our process, if you have suggestions for things we could change about the process while not compromising the public interest in preserving these parks, we'd appreciate your perspective. We're looking at all sorts of things, including whether all the forms of public notice we require for the hearing right now are really necessary, the extent to which we should. I think one of the things we're considering for minor applications is not requiring a formal environmental assessment, but doing, excuse me, our own desktop review of those proposals and having the applicant supplement that if we see through the department's mapping, such as the landscape mapping, that there might be resources that need to be analyzed, but just not requiring a detailed environmental assessment for every minor diversion up front. And then, we struggle with alternatives analysis requirements because I have yet to see an analysis that doesn't support what the applicant wants to do. So it's hard to feel sometimes like those analyses are meaningful, but it's probably not something we want to skip altogether. So we're open to suggestions on any aspect of the process, but those are some of the things we're focusing on. I don't know if anyone jumped in to say they wanted to comment on the process. Hold on.
See any? I think I have Mr. Moore.
I think most people who have been through the diversion process then just reach the conclusion they never want to have to go through it again. So.
We have a comment from Beekman, Monmouth County. I don't know if you'd like to speak your comment or I can read it for you. I think it's.
Sure, I could speak.
Hi.
How are you?
Hi, Jeff.
Jeff Beekman from Monmouth County. We're special county counsel. We've handled several diversions over the years for Monmouth County. A couple comments I have. One I just put in the chat, but I do find that, especially in places that are significantly developed, it's very difficult to find replacement properties when it comes to these reasonable diversions, when you're talking about the small intersection improvements or improvements where you're going to take a roadway that is somewhat dangerous or very dangerous in some cases, and make those more safe for the pedestrian traffic when you have a lot of parkland that butt up to these major or pretty major county and local roads that are highly trafficked. So I do think that looking at the ability to go outside of the existing watershed or the existing conservation area may be somewhere that you should look at being able to utilize for that replacement land. The other comment that I wanted to discuss is about the notice requirements. They seem a little bit burdensome, particularly when less and less people are reviewing the newspapers and things like that. One of the comments that I received from one of the staff in the county engineering department is it seems like most of the phone calls derive out of the large signs that are put in these parks when there's a diversion, as opposed to the notices in the paper, or even, and I don't have an issue really with the 200-foot list notice, and that's typical with typical land use applications. So that's not really burdensome. And sending all of those extra paper copies to the local library and to the local municipality, and those things seem to be burdensome. And I have never gotten a call out of, hey, I was in the local municipality and I saw your paperwork. What's going on here?
So that's interesting. This came up on Tuesday as well. So on the I'll address your comment about compensation, but let me start with the notices and the paper. So definitely we're going to cut out the display ad. Not enough people get a paper copy of the newspaper to ever see a display ad. We're going to eliminate that requirement. We're not sure that we're going to eliminate legal notices altogether, because we know that for municipalities and counties, it's an official form of notice. They're used to having to do it. And I'm aware that when the legislature has sometimes tried to eliminate legal notice requirements, the newspapers get up in arms because it's a revenue source that they don't want to miss out on. So I'm not sure that's a battle we want to fight right now. But I do agree that not many people see the legal notices, so I understand where that could be burdensome. We're certainly considering eliminating the 200-foot notification, because I'm not sure from most parks who the 200 feet really captures, since they're generally larger than that. And I would agree that the sign, which I'm happy to hear you feel is an effective form of notice, because it came up the other day too, that someone said that. I think the sign probably captures most people who would be captured by the 200-foot notification. So we're thinking it might be duplicative, but even if we, well, 200-foot, it would be hard to switch to email, because you're just not going to have those people's emails. But for other forms of notice, to the extent we can, we're certainly going to specify that it can be electronic. We're not looking to generate any more paper than we have to. The issue of depositing a copy of the application with the clerk in the library did come up the other day, and I'd be just as happy that people access the application online, but I think we do have to make at least a little bit of accommodation for people who might not have internet access. So I think we could probably eliminate putting it on file with the clerk, and maybe the library could request a copy if someone comes and requests it, but we're open to suggestion on that. And I also said the other day that we did the rule so long ago that right now they say that you have to post notice of the hearing on the website if you have one. So obviously that has changed. And I think what we would be telling people is to post it prominently on your website, and to put some of this information online and not generate all the paper. And we're looking into accepting applications digitally, because we know most of the time the things that you print out and send to us were created electronically, and you could send them to us electronically. So we're trying to make that transition ourselves. So that's very helpful to hear, and we're focusing on a lot of that ourselves already. On the issue of compensation for minor diversions, when we first instituted the minor major distinction, one of the things we said in the prior rulemaking was that we were trying to skew the process for minor diversions towards cash compensation, because we recognized that buying a little postage stamp as replacement for a little postage stamp was going to be difficult. And so that really is our preference for a minor diversion, that someone writes a check. But the problem right now is that you have to then deposit that check in your open space fund and spend it within a certain amount of time, or you have to surrender it to Trenton for us to throw in the big Green Acres pot of funding, which most of our applicants don't want to do. They don't want to feel like they're losing something in this process, even if it's a $10,000 or $15,000 check. So we can certainly think about ways we could make that less burdensome, but really for minor diversions, we don't want the staff to be spending a whole lot of time vetting replacement land, because we just want that money to go into open space somewhere. And it's a whole lot easier if it just goes into an account than evaluating the due diligence for a really tiny piece of land as replacement. So I appreciate the comment. If you think of other ways we could address that after this session, just drop us a line.
Can you hear me?
I can hear somebody, but I don't know who. Could you identify yourself?
Sorry, this is Jessica Kabita from Monmouth County.
Okay, I know. I can see from the chat you were having trouble unmuting. So yes, we can hear you now. And
I think I got Joe. Hopefully Joe Ator is on the line as well, because we definitely have. Yeah, okay, good. We have experience that we'd like to share, and I appreciate Jeff Beekman speaking on our behalf, or not on our behalf, but based on his experience with the minor diversions. It's been really difficult. And quite frankly, I don't have ideas. And I was hoping, that Jeff, I think Andy's on here too, Andy Koyman from the park system, Monmouth County Park System, and Joe Ator, who's the Monmouth County engineer, might have ideas for you. I understand why, like I spoke on Tuesday, I understand why you make it difficult, but oh my goodness, it's really challenging to just do, a slight improvement to a bridge project or a road project, and you guys have been great to work with, but I just feel like it's so too much. And Jeff spoke to it as well, and you just touched on what we spoke about on Tuesday, which was the public noticing, the paper copies, the newspapers, and how that's so antiquated at this point.
So Jeff, I saw you put in the chat that you had one more comment on the notice, and then I think you put the comment in the chat to say it might be effective to simply require the county to have the notice in their agenda 15 to 30 days prior to the hearings, along with requesting it to be on the local agenda when it is a county project. Honestly, we've been trying to figure out whether we could do some sort of general permit or permit by rule approach for some of these smaller projects, but the obstacle is that all the Green Acres statutes over the years say that you have to have a public hearing before the State House Commission approves a diversion. So we thought at one point we could do kind of a joint rulemaking with the commission and have them kind of pre-approve certain categories of diversions. But the statute would seem to indicate you need an individual hearing on an individual project before you go to the commission. So I don't know that we're going to be successful in getting quite all the way there, but we are trying to streamline the process. And yeah, our goal is just effective form of notice. We're not trying to come up with the greatest volume of notice. We're just trying to figure out what reaches people. And the 30 days that we require now as notice of the hearing is not exactly statutory. The statutes say that the hearing has to be held 30 days before State House Commission approval, but our process takes so long, that's never an issue. So I think we could possibly cut back on the lead time for some of these hearings as well as a way of shortening the process. And right now we allow 2 weeks after each hearing for public comment. written public comment, but I think in our experience, not too many people submit post-hearing public comments. So I think we might be able to shorten things both on the back end, on the front end, just to compress the process down a little more. And to the extent we can for a minor application, if we can integrate those hearings into a county commission meeting or a town council meeting, I think we'd encourage people to do that. So again, anything you guys can suggest to us based on your real world experience, but I do agree with you, Jessica, that we just did not make the minor process minor enough. So we're looking to change that.
No, I appreciate that. You know, maybe after this conversation, you know, I can talk to Joe and Jeff and maybe get their ideas. I know you're seeking input, whether formally or informally, and so, and then again, I don't know if Jeff or Joe heard you're going to continue to have stakeholder meetings through January.
Yes, so we're going to have one on January 11th that we're going to specifically advertise to the nonprofits, but it's open to the public and it will be listed on our website. We're going to do another session on January 18th where we're going to send out the notice again through our Office of Local Government Assistance to all their municipal and county contacts. The following week, we're going to do sessions, I think, on the 24th and the 26th that are just going to be open to the public. And we may try to gear them to specific topics. We were kind of waiting to see how today's meeting went before we made that decision. And then we'll probably do one more session after that in the evening to capture people who were not able to attend during the day. So that will take us through the end of January. And at that point, we're going to start putting pen to paper and trying to draft some new rules.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that email link that Nancy just posted doesn't have the January meetings on it, but as we finalize that schedule, they'll be posted on that link on our
Right, we'll be
webpage.
listing those meetings there soon, but the link to join the future meetings is going to be the same as the one today. So I think I mentioned at the beginning, you just need to know the date and time and you can use the same link to join us.
And I think we're about at the halfway point. If we wanted to kind of break and see if we have some additional comments or follow-up discussion we want to do.
Well, two things. I think one of the people on the phone is Bob Moss. Bob, you're called in and you're listed separately, maybe?
Well, I called in. I don't do this often, so yeah, I put my name in at the beginning and then called one of the numbers that Teams gave out.
Okay, I'm actually not seeing anybody listed right now as being on the phone. We were trying to use kind of the halfway point to call on those people.
Yeah,
but
I thought on the phone meant only on the phone.
Right. For when people only call in, then we can see their phone number, but we can't see who they are. And they can't necessarily see the chat or tell us that way that they want to speak. So we were using the halfway point of the meeting as an opportunity to call on those people, but I'm not seeing any phone numbers in this list right now. So I don't think we have anybody who's only on the phone right now. So I think what we want to do is just take a 10-minute break and then we're going to leave the recording on so we don't interrupt the recording and don't end up with two separate recordings of this meeting. But we're gonna take a 10-minute break for people to stretch their legs, and we'll resume. And we'll take another look at the hot topics list while we're on the break. We might throw a few other issues out there for you to give us your input on. But then, depending on whether additional people want to comment, we might close the record before our time is up. We ended up doing that on Tuesday because people just ran out of things they wanted to say. So, but we'll give you a little break and then we'll come back on the record in 10 minutes, which would be 10:45.
That sounds good. I'll put that in the chat too. So see everyone back in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Oh. Caroline and Nancy, I think we're ready to go back on.
Okay.
So I think we have just about the same number of people as before we took our break. And I don't know if we've had anybody indicate in the chat that they wanted to comment. I'm not seeing anyone.
Yeah, nothing new, but
Okay, let me look at the hot topics list again then.
Hey, Judith?
Yes, who is speaking?
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes, but can you identify yourself?
Yes, it's Jessica Kabita from Monmouth County.
Hi.
Hi. So I was just speaking to Joe Ator, and I know we touched on it briefly, the amendment procedure as well. We spoke about it briefly on Tuesday. My experience being that, it appeared that the land was encumbered right up to the road, but the municipal code said that we had right-of-way of 60 feet, I believe it was. And so we were able to work it out with an amendment procedure. But again, with the public noticing, it's almost as cumbersome as the minor diversion, like you were saying, and then as cumbersome as the major diversion. So
I think any changes we make to the public notice requirements for the diversion process are probably going to apply uniformly across the board to anything in the new chapter that requires a public hearing. In fact, one of the things I've done just to get a head start on the rule drafting is I've been spending a little time working on kind of the housekeeping aspects of the rules, and my intention is to pull the public hearing requirements, including notice requirements, all into one place that people could refer to when a public hearing is required. So all those things we were talking about for streamlining the notices for diversions would apply equally to Rosie amendments. And we still want people to know what we're doing when we amend a Rosie, because it functionally can be the equivalent of a diversion. If you take something off the inventory and all of a sudden it's not parkland, it's as if you diverted it in the eyes of many. So, there's still going to be a process, but what I was saying about eliminating display ads and maybe tightening up the timeframes, that will all apply to the Rosie Amendment process as well.
Okay, and I do apologize. Like I said, I was having some technical difficulties, so I wasn't paying attention too much. You had a brief chat about using monetary compensation instead of land compensation. I know that Monmouth County has been doing a lot of land compensation, but there is an option for monetary compensation, correct?
Yes. So
hierarchy.
So right now, and we said this when we created the minor major distinction in 2005, that one of the things we were trying to accomplish in creating a category of minor diversions was to define a category of very small scale diversions. So we put limits on acreage and percentage, and projects that have an obvious public purpose, such as a road project, where we could collect monetary compensation and cut out the whole process involved with identifying and vetting replacement land. So the theory was that if you create this small category of minor diversions and you have the applicants write a check and put that back into the Green Acres Fund, that overall, you're not going to have a net loss of parkland statewide if for the bigger diversions you required a minimum 2-to-1 compensation. So it was kind of 1-to-1 compensation for minor, 2-to-1 for major. If it's a public project, it's higher if it's a private project. And in the end, you're not going to lose parkland, even though you're writing checks for some of these smaller diversions. The problem is that your option to spend the money, some of the bond acts require only land replacements. Some allow what we call park improvements. So it's easy to kind of decide if you have a small amount of money that you might put that into a playground. It's harder to put that small amount of money into land. And if your diversion occurs under a bond act that requires replacement land, it's really hard to take that small amount of money and turn it into land. But at the same time, most applicants do not want to take that check and send it to Trenton and never see that money again. So they always say to us, oh, we'll figure out within the next 2 years what we're going to spend that on. We have some projects pending. We can throw that into the project, and then you have to track it for the next 2 years, and you have to make sure that that actually happens. So our preference really would be for the minor projects that people write a check and move on. But it just doesn't always happen that way.
Because if we work with the parks, like the Monmouth County Park System, can we give money to the park system to do an acquisition? Because they're very active in their acquisitions. Or does it have
yes,
to go
but it would have to happen within a 2-year time frame. So we do allow what I refer to as the player to be named later. So we recognize that at the time that a diversion needs to happen, that sometimes there's an emergency, sometimes you're just trying to meet funding deadlines. You can't always identify the replacement at the time of the diversion. We try to avoid that, but if you've demonstrated to us that you really can't figure out the replacement at the time that you applied, we allow up to 2 years to purchase the replacement land. So in what you're describing, if the county had an acquisition project in the works and there was a small amount of money available from a minor diversion, you could throw that money into that acquisition. We, on paper at least, would allocate some of the acquisition as replacement, and the rest would be your normal funding sources. And that can happen. But depending on where you are in the state and what the circumstances and timing of the diversion are, there's just not always something in the works to spend that money on. In which case, the way it was supposed to work is again, you just throw the money back into the big Green Acres pot. It doesn't necessarily come back to Monmouth County, but it goes somewhere for land acquisition.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Joe Torre, the county engineer from Monmouth. I wanted to follow up on Jessica's comments, if I might.
Sure.
Thank you. So on the minor diversion, am I understanding that depending on the original funding source, and before I start, let me just say that just to follow up on something Jessica had said earlier, was just how much we do appreciate the guidance we have from your office. Although we do find the effort sometimes to be onerous, I can tell you that the guidance that we get is extremely helpful, and we truly see this as a partnership to achieve both your goals and ours. As a county engineer, my goals are to maintain, public safety, transportation, but I certainly understand the goals of Green Acres and our Monmouth County Park System, and it's really been a team effort. And I do want to just compliment you and your staff on just how helpful you are helping us navigate through those rules. That being
Thank you.
said,
We appreciate that.
yeah, that being said, I do want to follow up on the comment and maybe clarification for me on the monetary compensation for parkland. It's my understanding, maybe incorrectly so, that there are certain conditions under which, for a minor diversion, monetary compensation is not an option. And I thought it had to do with the original Bond Act, which you may have mentioned, that was used to purchase that land. Is that correct, or am I wrong on that?
So monetary compensation is always an option. The thing you might not have an option about is what it is spent on.
Okay.
So, because you can have monetary compensation just for the sake of monetary compensation, or you could spend the monetary compensation either on park improvements or land acquisition. So that's what I was referring to before. When we did those rules in 2005, we did not realize somehow that some of the bonds acts were written differently. Some only talk about replacement land. Some talk about either park improvements or replacement land as being appropriate compensation. Under either one of those scenarios, we will accept monetary compensation, but then you have to identify what you're going to spend it on. Is it going to go for park improvements, or is it going to go for land acquisition, or is it just going to go to Trenton and we throw it in the Green Acres Fund and it goes back to the source? So, so I think the confusion is about what you're allowed to spend it on.
Right.
But we still plan on offering monetary compensation as an option and as the preferred option for a minor diversion.
Right. I was glad to hear you say the deferred option for minor diversion, because quite frankly, for many of our county projects, there are very minor strips along existing roads that have really the minimus impact on an overall large tract of land that's in the Green Acres program. It's just that small exclusionary frontage along the road that really, quite frankly, if you're making transportation improvements, safety improvements, benefits all users of the roads, including the visitors to the park. So there's, that purpose. We hope that Green Acres finds general public safety to be a justifiable reason for the minor diversion. That being said, I know we have Monmouth County Parks on the call as well. My experience with our parks is that they absolutely are very active and always have good projects that would that I think would qualify under the public or the use of those dollars for acceptable purposes. The question that I have is, does it have to be spent on the park from which the property is being impacted?
No.
It can be anywhere within the.
Well, you start, it's kind of a radiating circles type of thing. You start with the municipality, right. You can go out to the county level, and in some cases you can go out to the watershed level. I think what Jeff might have been asking earlier, somebody else might have asked, is whether you could go out even further than that. That's something we'll think about. I don't know if we'll adopt that change or not. But obviously the preference is to replace it as close as you can to the original location, but it's not required to be part of the park.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Well, just also keep in mind that, I mean, different counties do this differently, but I think for purposes of projects in Monmouth County, the park system or the park commission is the applicant and, is potentially driving the bus as to how they propose to compensate for these projects. So I'm telling you what we will accept, but you have to figure out within the county what your park system wants.
I understand. But as long as that option is there, then I think it's up to the local entity having jurisdiction over the Green Acres to, if they are concerned about the money going back into the state pot, then they don't have to accept the monetary. But as long as it's on the table, then I think you're giving the option, to the local agency. And that also hopefully minimizes the amount of work at your staff level.
Yeah, and I was thinking that when you were making your comments, that part of this really has to do with our staff not having to track these very small projects once they're approved. Because unless the replacement land is signed, sealed, and delivered at the point of the approval, then Nancy or somebody has to spend the next 2 years worrying about whether the county's actually going to purchase something in the required time frame and whether they've done the appropriate due diligence. It's just not worth it for projects that small. It's not what our staff should be spending their time on. And it's part of why we created the minor category in the first place, because we don't want minor diversions to take up just as much staff time as larger diversions. We realize now we didn't ease up enough on the process, and some of them still take a long time, so we're trying to correct that. But we really would rather, in most of those cases, not have to track it. Writing a check and depositing it in the appropriate place allows us to close that case file and move on to larger diversions and other things that you want us to review. So I think we have similar objectives there. Jeff Beekman's pointing out that the watershed level is often smaller than the county level for county projects and diversions. I do agree with that. I do recognize that. So I think part of the problem with the suggestion, Jeff, is right now you're allowed to go municipal, county, watershed. I don't know what the next level past that would be. Would we say tri-county area? Like, it almost would be, then we'd have to say you could identify replacement land anywhere in the state, which I don't know most times the applicants would want to do. I think kind of the equivalent of that is you redeposit the money in the Green Acres account and we figure out where in the state to spend it. So I think if we were to go beyond the county level, I'd need a little bit more of a suggestion as to how I would even define that.
I do have a follow-up question, if I might, still Joe Torres.
Sure, absolutely.
So regarding the amendment that Jessica had touched on, Monmouth County and most counties are required to have a master plan for our roads and bridges. And within the master plan, there's a recommended right-of-way width to maintain those structures. We have had situations in the past where there have been parcels acquired after the adoption of the master plan. And say, for example, there's a 60-foot right of way, a 30-foot half width, but there's only a 25-foot, 50-foot right of way that exists. So we would need 5 feet either side to get to the master plan width. But then the Green Acres parcel was acquired from a property owner and entered into the ROSI without excluding that additional 5 feet, which really is an oversight more so than the original intent. So I believe, does that qualify as an amendment?
I think part of the problem there is that in your county, does the road department or the engineering department, is the name of that department actually on the deed for the right of way? Like, do different parts of the counties actually hold property interests?
No, it is County of Monmouth.
Well, certainly adjusting road rights of way is something that we see pretty often as a reason for diversion. And going back to your earlier comment, and I said this on Tuesday when Jessica raised a similar comment. I mean, for the most part, I think we consider road projects, intersection improvements to meet our public need, public benefit thresholds. What we tend to focus on is alternatives, and does the project need to be on parkland? And I use the example that often there's residences on one side and the park on the other. And of course, the road projects always end up at the park side. And we say, why can't they end up on the residential side? Which of course the residents don't want to hear. So, those are the types of arguments we end up in about those projects, but we're usually not questioning the public need for the project. But I think in the example you're giving, if you are looking to take that off the inventory because it wasn't excluded before it went on the inventory. I think unfortunately most times we're going to call that a diversion. Part of the problem being that the towns that do carve out right away from their acquisitions, usually there's an accounting of kind of what's on the park side, where the park dedicated park funding is going, and where the highway money is going. So I think in the past, and I don't see that this is something that's going to change. Most times we have to call that a diversion, but if you'd like to give us more specifics about your master plan and why you think it might control the situation, we can take a look at that.
Thank you. We'll try and prepare something for the January.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're trying to make an argument that by operation of law, it was already somehow dedicated, but we'd have to take a closer look at that particular scenario.
We'll try and have follow-up information for you at an upcoming meeting, the January 11th or 18th.
Bob Moss, I see your comment about the mention of compensation in the bond acts. I think that's something we would have to look at offline. We've come up with a little matrix of what we think the various bond acts say, and we could share that with you, but I would have to take a closer look at what you're saying offline. This whole issue of park improvements versus land as compensation came to a head in a diversion we approved in Stafford, where the county wanted to put solar panels on top of a former landfill that had been restricted with a conservation restriction. And right now, the rules still say, and they said then, that for a property that was to be leased and where the lease constituted the diversion, that the lease revenue could be the appropriate compensation and could go into park improvements. The idea being that if you're leasing a property, you're not losing it forever. You can use that money to improve your parks, but you're getting that property back someday. We weren't necessarily requiring that it be replaced. Well, we did get sued about that approval, and one of the issues the appellants raised was whether the particular bond act that encumbered the landfill only allowed replacement land. And the court did agree with them on that, which caused us to go back and try to parse out what the various bond acts said. So just by omission, some of them don't mention park improvements as something that the State House Commission can accept as compensation, because at the end of our diversion process, there's a dual approval by the DEP commissioner and this legislative commission called the State House Commission. And each of those bond acts says a slightly different thing about what the standard is for them to give their approval, but some of them just don't mention park improvements at all as being an option for how they can value the diversion. So that's the basis for my comment earlier. We'll take a closer look at what you're saying, Bob, but I'd have to look at that all offline. Someone's asking, when can we reasonably expect the new rules / changes to go into effect? So rulemaking is a pretty formal process that involves a proposal that gets published in the New Jersey Register, which is a publication of the State Office of Administrative Law, where all the state agencies propose their administrative rules. At that point, I believe we'll be required to have at least one, if not two, additional public hearings on what we end up proposing. We'll be required to give a detailed explanation of what it is that we're proposing. And then there is a public comment period on the actual rule language. We often get hundreds of comments on proposals of this magnitude. So we would then, our rulemaking team would have to spend time responding to those comments in writing, deciding what we might want to change as part of the final proposal, and then going through what's called an adoption process. Once we propose rule language, we're unfortunately somewhat constrained in what we can change. I think there's been a little more flexibility in recent years, but basically we can't make substantive changes changes that are so substantial that they would destroy the value of the original public notice. So once we figure out what we want the new rules to say and we propose something, we're either going to be limited in what we can change or we're going to have to start all over again. But as far as timing, our administration wants us to focus on this during 2023 and get as close as we can to having new rules in place by the end of 2023. That's a pretty ambitious timeline for a rulemaking of this magnitude, so we don't know if we're going to make that, but that is our charge. So you will certainly have an opportunity to comment on the specifics of what we end up proposing, and then we'll just have to see if we've gotten close enough to actually adopt what we propose.
Hi, this is Alazar Zoraju. I just asked the question regarding the rough estimation of the timeline. It
Yes.
sounds as though we certainly shouldn't expect anything to take effect in 23. I guess it's possible in 24, but we're probably looking at like 2 to 3 years before these rules are implemented.
Well, don't say that in front of my boss, but
I'm
certainly
sorry.
if it were 2023, it would be really late in 2023. So I would say first quarter of 24 is realistic.
Okay, so there would be no reason to wait on any diversions for these new rules to take place. If we've got them coming up, get them in, and until further notice, the current rules are what we need to go off of.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
And I don't know in the end that the compensation requirements are going to change all that much. We're trying to focus on the process and what we can do to ease up on the process while still protecting the public interest. But we don't get too much comment one way or another on the compensation requirements for major diversions. People seem to understand that if they need to do something on a park that was supposed to be permanently preserved, that there is compensation due for that. I will say that something we've asked people about over the years that is not on the list is we have a tree replacement formula that in some cases can result in pretty high numbers for what people have to pay for tree replacement if they're not able to do the plantings themselves. But over the years, we've asked at several different conferences and different forums for input on what an alternative to that formula might be, and nobody's ever suggested anything to us. So I don't know if we're going to change that formula or not. It's what you call a basal area replacement formula. So it's looking to replace the trees based on area and not necessarily just based on how tall or what age they are. So if people want to write into us about that, they can. But I mean, right now, nobody's really commented one way or another or asking us one way or another to change the compensation requirements. We're kind of focusing more on the process. One thing I did throw out there on Tuesday, although I think in the end we didn't get too much comment on it. We're struggling right now a little bit with the fact that we have a role in reviewing leases of funded parkland. So if we helped you buy the land or if we helped you build the facilities with Green Acres funding, you're required to get our approval before you lease it out. And we're not trying to run the parks, but we recognize that entering into a lease with a third party has the potential to put the parks off limits to the public or at least interfere with reasonable public access. And in some cases, it could be that we disagree that what you want to do through the lease is consistent with that definition of recreation and conservation purposes. So the rules do specify that we're supposed to see those leases 45 days in advance to give us sufficient time to review them. And it does specify some minimum requirements for what should be in the lease. When we did the rules in 2005, we said that we would no longer review leases for unfunded parkland, but that people could send them to us if they want. we adopted more of a kind of permit by rule approach there and said, we're not going to review a lease for unfunded parkland, but it still needs to meet the requirements, but you can figure that out. You can ask us to look at it if you want to. That's all by way of saying we get a lot of leases, but we probably don't get all the leases that we should. We try to gather them up when we do our routine compliance inspections if we haven't already seen them. But then when we do get them, we often get them last minute. People are trying to get their sports leagues set up for the spring, or they're trying to engage with farmers or get a construction project off the ground. And we often find ourselves rushed in our review. So we're open to comment on whether there's anything we could change about that process that would make things easier both for us and for you. We still feel like we should have a role in this. We're thinking about whether we can at least offer a template for farm leases based on some interactions we've had with some of the nonprofits, where we would say, if you follow this form, then, although we'd still need to do a quick review, you'll be okay, and we won't have to spend too much time reviewing that lease. Other types of uses don't seem to really lend themselves to a template necessarily, but it just puts us in the position of having to spend a lot of time reviewing leases. So if anybody has any suggestions on that topic, we'd be open to them. And then I think if you looked at the hot topic issue, the other thing that we were expecting people to have comment on, but there hasn't been too much discussion about yet, is food service and event space and restaurants and that type of use. I think over the last 15 years, we've gotten a lot of inquiries about putting restaurants on parks because they're perceived as a moneymaker. Our general policy is that food service in a park should be an amenity for the park and not a destination in and of itself. So it should be that if you're visiting the local zoo and you want to get something to eat while you're there, you can, but not that you're going to that food establishment because it's a white tablecloth 5-star restaurant with a celebrity chef. So, sometimes we find ourselves having a difference of opinion as to with our funding partners about whether what they have in mind meets our policy. And it's something that we thought people might want to comment on. We've always felt, but the rule's not that specific on this, that for marinas and golf courses, patrons of those types of recreational facilities do expect that there will be at least a full service restaurant as part of those facilities. And often there's also like a smaller snack bar. But when you get into multiple restaurants in those locations or full service restaurants elsewhere in the park system, things get a little problematic. So there's also obviously been a trend towards people wanting to have weddings outdoors and in barns and other structures that sometimes you find on parks, and sometimes we're asked to approve leases and have to balance, is this becoming a wedding venue, or is this an amenity for the park, potentially a revenue source for the park that won't interfere with public use of the park. So that's certainly something we anticipate putting at least a little more detail on the rules about. Are we to submit every lease facility use permit with every sports league to DEP? So a couple of things. We define a concession agreement as being an agreement of a year or less where someone is either operating a facility or providing service to your park. So you use the term facility use permit. If it really is a permit for a month, a week, a couple of months, a season, we don't necessarily want to see those agreements because we figure something of that length is not going to create the problems that we're concerned about with long-term leases. And we didn't want to get involved in the fights about who who sells the hot dogs at the concession stand at the Little League field. We just wanted to stay out of those types of arrangements. So a year or less, you're good. You don't have to come to us. But if you're turning your baseball fields over to your local Little League for a period of 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, yeah, those leases need to come to us and we need to take a look at that. And one of the things we're going to be concerned about is whether they're running the show as far as scheduling and whether they're in any way excluding the public from a Green Acres funded facility. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? I think we've gone through a lot of the topics on our list, unless Karen Gilbert has another question. That's great. Do you want to go back on the mic for that?
Yeah, thank you. I have a particular situation. We have a lease agreement with a soccer club where it's open space property, but they use it as their sports facility, with the understanding that when they're not using it, it's open to the public. Now, we have a contract in place, a lease agreement, and it's been that way. It's expiring, I think, in a year or so. It's been that way for a number of years. Is that something that we should have submitted to the DEP? Because I don't think we did.
Well, first question is whether it's a funded or an unfunded property. So did we help you buy it? Did we help you develop the soccer fields?
You did not help us develop the soccer fields. That was privately funded, but it's on our ROSI. And I don't know if we use Green Acres funds to acquire the property off the top of my head.
Okay, so that's going to matter. I mean, funded parkland, yes, it's mandatory. Any agreement, lease or use agreement for over a year, we need to see.
Okay.
And again, because we know we don't see as many as the volume of parkland would indicate we should, when we go out and do our routine 3 to 5 year compliance inspections, we try to do a sweep and collect any leases you might have in your files. Again, I'm sure we don't get all of them that we should, but we at least ask for them then. If what you're describing is a property we didn't help you buy and we didn't help you develop the facilities, you actually have a lot more discretion in scheduling those facilities. The rule still says you have to follow certain standards, including providing reasonable public access, but what reasonable public access is for a completely unfunded property is going to be different than what it is for a Green Acres funded property. So I think for that particular one, we probably have to put you in contact with your county compliance officer and kind of work through the facts of that one to be able to answer your question. We try not to exercise control over the unfunded facilities on unfunded parkland. There's a general public interest in maintaining reasonable public access to the facilities that are either on land purchased with general New Jersey taxpayer dollars or developed with those dollars, meaning Green Acres funds. But and our interest is in preserving your existing parks so that towns don't turn around and sell them when they take Green Acres money. But we try not to overreach on the completely unfunded properties as far as how you manage and schedule your facilities. So I think that one's going to be fact sensitive depending on whether we helped you acquire the property in the first place.
That's good to know. I'll look into it further. I know that we hadn't been submitting our farm leases. That was something that was an oversight on our part. And so we're taking care of that this year. So, we're trying to get in compliance.
And we don't assume that you're not trying to get into compliance. We just assume that a lot of people don't sit around reading our rules on a regular basis. So we try to educate people as we have the opportunity.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, I couldn't remember what county you were in. Nancy just pointed out that your compliance officer is Kevin Applegate, who I think was on the call at least earlier I don't know if he's still on. So
Yeah,
that's who you
we've been in touch with Kevin. He's been following up on our facilities and reviewing them and telling us what we need to provide, and we've been doing that, but I just don't remember this one coming up. So
Okay.
I'll reach out to Kevin. Thank you.
Okay, great. Would anyone else like to comment? I'm not going to put any of our staff on the spot necessarily, but I know we have a couple of our compliance officers on the phone. And if they have issues they'd like to throw out for comment, you can feel free, or you can send a chat message to Nancy and she can throw it out there. I believe Bob Moss wants to comment again. Go ahead.
Am I on now?
Yes.
Yes, but I muted myself, so you didn't hear me say that.
Oh, okay. No, I just going back to that Stafford. If you could also send me an email, I'll just put the docket number on there. I don't see any reference to the bond acts in that appellate court decision. So I'll just put the information on. Go ahead.
I don't know that the appellate division decision referenced the Bond Act. What it did reference was the Garden State Preservation Trust Act, which was the enabling act for the what was originally a dedication of the sales tax that eventually some of that got turned into bonds. But anyway, you know, Green Acres since 1961 has been funded by a series of bond acts, but then more recently, starting with the Garden State Preservation Trust Act, there was a dedication of the sales tax, followed by a dedication of the corporate business tax as being our present source of funding. So the Stafford decision talks about what the Garden State Preservation Trust Act says. That was the enabling act for that particular source of funding. But then if you go back to the earlier bond acts and the associated enabling acts, they all have particular provisions saying if you want to divert, you need approval from the commissioner and the State House Commission that they are not supposed to give unless you offer something.
Right. Okay, so, I'll check the enabling acts. I was looking in the wrong place.
Yeah, and that's it's not an obvious thing.
Yeah.
But the Stafford case did cause us to go back and look at every one of those prior statutes and try to figure out what does this one allow, what does that one allow, and it up until then we had tried not to have to do that, but we realized that was not a correct approach. So now that's one of the things that's kind of part of our checklist when we review an application is we try to figure out what the options are as far as replacement.
Right, monetary and or land. Basically, I got to keep that in mind because I'm.
Well, now it's so you're always going to be able to write a check, but it's can the check be spent on park improvements or land?
Oh, okay, improvements versus land. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Very good. I'll check on that, and I'll get your email address and send you what I find out. It sounds like we're closing up here.
We're here till noon. I'm not sure anybody else wants to comment. Our email addresses have not changed since the reorganization. They're still general DEP email addresses, so you should.
Well, if you're going to be here, I'll look it up before noon, see what I can find.
Okay. While Bob's doing that, would anybody else like to comment? Just looking back in the chat to make sure we didn't miss anybody. So while we're waiting to see if anyone else wants to comment, just as a housekeeping matter, we mentioned at the beginning that we're recording this session. We have posted the video of the first stakeholder session from November 29th, which was with the nonprofits. We posted that on the webpage. We need to have our IT department work its magic on the video from this past Tuesday so that we can post that one as well. And we'll do the same with this recording, and we'll put that on the webpage if anybody wants to go back and look at it. And so for the future sessions in January, we'll do the same if you're not able to make those sessions and you're curious what ends up being discussed. I'm just looking at the hot topics list again. One of the things we mentioned on the hot topics list is that when the Preserve New Jersey Act was reauthorized, so I just mentioned that our most recent source of funding and what's considered to be our stable source of funding is a dedication of the corporate business tax that was put into place by statewide referendum. I forget what year it was, but in the prior administration. And the referendum authorized the dedication of a certain portion of the corporate business tax to us, the Farmland Preservation Program, and the Historic Trust, but didn't specify what the division of that money would be or anything else about how it would be spent. So legislation was passed shortly after the ballot question passed to divide up the money, but it had a 2 or 3 year sunset provision and needed to be reauthorized. So that happened in this administration. And one of the things that went along with it is that we were given civil administrative penalty authority that we would then have to implement through this rulemaking. So in the past, our most effective compliance tool has been the ability to withhold future Green Acres funding from whatever entity is not complying with our rules or has not an authorized diversion. But some towns took our money once, never plan to take it again. With the advent of the local and county open space taxes, again, some towns don't take as much advantage of Green Acres funding as they used to. And withholding funding in particularly in urban areas is sometimes problematic because you don't want to foreclose opportunities that may not come back again to create parks or preserve land while you're trying to resolve your outstanding compliance issues. So for a lot of different reasons, I think the administration felt like it was time to at least put the possibility of civil administrative penalties into our toolbox. We've had the authority for a little while now, but we can't use it until we put it into the rules as far as what the parameters for that would be. So that's another purpose of this upcoming rulemaking, is to implement that authority. We talked a little about farming and about the possibility of us coming up with some sort of farm lease template. I guess another question, or some related questions that we seem to have gotten the last couple of years, have to do with establishment of CSAs, community supported agriculture, on parks. Often when you have a farm lease or an operation like a CSA, then the farmer or the CSA operator wants greenhouses to be able to extend the season and facilitate what they're doing with agriculture. And that gets a little problematic as far as whether things are veering too much in the direction of agriculture, which is not technically part of our definition. So we do struggle a bit with what the conditions should be on farm leases and the extent to which we should allow farming on on parks, although we do recognize that in a lot of cases, towns and counties authorize it as a way of keeping the fields open, providing some opportunities for the farmer, enhancing wildlife habitat. So there's a lot of reasons to allow it, but we try to maintain the balance between farming and recreation and conservation. And there's actually, I don't know if anyone from Montgomery Township is on the phone, but there's actually litigation in Montgomery Township about the extent to which agriculture should be allowed on green acres and covered properties. So the outcome of that case might, in the long term, determine what we're allowed to do with farm leases. Okay, again, I think we've covered a lot of the topics that we threw out there as hot issues. I think people have raised a few more things with us. I'm not seeing anyone say they want to comment. You're welcome. I should have said this at the beginning, that people were welcome to drop in and drop out, but I think we're close enough to the end of our advertised time that Nancy, Caroline, and I are going to stick around for a few more minutes. But you're welcome, if you've said what you want to say, to leave the chat, leave the meeting, and like I said, we will be posting the video of the meeting online if you want to check back later, make sure you didn't miss anything. But we do appreciate your time today and your input, and we look forward to talking to you in January if you'd like to join us then.
Should I stop recording now, Judith?
We do have a few people leaving the chat. Bob, do you plan on going back on the record, or you're going to talk to us offline?
Oh, since you ask, I was just typing, but could you send me a copy? You mentioned a chart or a table or something of where it specifies compensation for park improvements versus land acquisition. Could you just send that to me?
We just did a little table for ourselves as a cheat sheet, but I think that's something we could share with you.
Yeah, okay. Do you need me to type my address again?
I think we have your address.
Okay, well, I'm just going to put it in here.
That's fine. That's helpful. Thank you.
What is it? Verizon.net. Can't type under pressure. Okay, and I'll just enter it like that. So at your leisure, or no, at your convenience, if you send that to me, that would be great.
Okay, Caroline, I think you can stop recording. I think, as I said, you, Nancy, and I will hang on the phone for a short while later.
Okay. All right. Thanks for your time and input, everyone. I'm going to stop recording now. There we go.